Hello and welcome to Flit Cult Literacy. This is Jen. I am a science communicator and cult literacy activist, and today we are going to be covering the B.I.T.E model of authoritarian control. This is a model to describe cults that was developed by Dr. Hassan, who is one of the preeminent cult psychologists in the world at the moment. Has fantastic ideas, and he's a cult survivor himself. Now, for those of you who may not be familiar, a model is kind of like a map. It's a way to describe the territory of a given scientific field. So, in this case, the B.I.T.E model, B.I.T.E, B-I-T-E, stands for the different types of control that a cult exerts over an individual. You can think of each letter as a string that the cult leaders pull to operate an individual, kind of like a marionette. B stands for behavior control, I stands for information control, and T stands for thought control, then last, E stands for emotion control. So, altogether, that's B-I-T-E, B.I.T.E, kind of a snappy acronym, easy to remember, and a great model to start with when you're starting to wrap your head around how cults work. Now, the B, behavior control. This is an important string that the cult leaders pull. You see, the more an individual's behavior can be controlled, the more the rest of their experience is affected as well. So behavior control is regulating an individual's physical reality. I'm reading that section from Dr. Hassan's website, and I'll include a link in the description. Behavior control can include anything from controlling how people dress, controlling when you wake up, when you go to sleep, controlling, requiring permission for major decisions, choosing who you marry, all those sorts of things. And I can remember when I was in a cult, there were different types of behavior control that were exerted on you depending on what position you occupied in the group. The general members had a certain amount of behavior control. There were rules and regulations about what we ate and drank, what we could watch and don't watch. That actually factors into some of the later things, information control. But it became especially intensive when you were doing evangelical work for the church, when you served as a missionary. I can remember in that missionary service, it was dictated to us every day what we wore. We weren't allowed to use our first names. We had to use our titles. It was dictated to us when we got up, when we went to sleep, the whole bit. Ritualistic clothing is under behavior control as well. And it's not necessarily bad for a group to have clothing that is associated with their culture, and it's important to be open-minded and kind about that. Where it becomes an issue of behavior control is when these sorts of ritualistic clothing articles are mandated. And I know I'm, touching on a touchy subject here, but speaking from my own experience, having been involved in a cult where certain ritualistic clothing was required, we were told that we had to wear this clothing at all times, except for when bathing, basically, and maybe a couple of other exceptions. But we were supposed to wear this special clothing at all times, and there were mystical properties attributed to it, and we were warned of dire consequences if we ever took it off. That it was a protection to us from Satan and from demons, and that if we were to not wear it all the time like we were supposed to, then we wouldn't be protected from harm spiritually or physically. That's a type of behavior control. And, it may seem odd that a person should that they should try to control people with clothes. But if you think about it, if you can get a person into a frame of mind where they believe that they have to wear, I'll just make up a piece of clothing so I'm not picking on any particular group. Let's say you have to wear a particular bracelet or ring, and you believe that if you ever take this pinky ring off, let's say, that you will immediately be beset by demons, and you wear it all the time, you put it on in the morning, and you think about your dedication to the group. It's a personal sign of obedience and subservience that you wear every day. You put it on your finger because you trust that the group leaders are telling the truth and that you're going to be attacked by demons if you ever take it off. Now, that sounds kind of silly, and it is, but if you can get a person into a state where they believe that, there's not much that you can't get them to believe or do. You've got a person very much in your control if you can get them into that sort of psychological state that they'll believe that about an article of clothing that you have authority over. It's a massive, deep level of control. There's a saying, and I've mentioned this in the previous video as well, that those who can convince us to believe absurdities can get us to commit atrocities. There's nothing you won't do by that point if you believe that about an article of clothing that they're making you wear. So again, not to express any prejudice against people that wear religious clothing, but it can be used as a method of control. So if there are any groups that you're involved in that may utilize that sort of control, that's a red flag. Beware. So that's B, behavior control. Information control. Information control is a big one. If you can control the story that people tell themselves about reality, then you control the person. This is a huge string in those 4 letters that is pulled to control a person. Huge marionette string. What does information control look like? There are more and less overt versions of it. Everybody tries to, control their own story and express what they believe about themselves and try to prevent other people from messing with that story. But it can be taken to an extreme. If an organization, for instance, tries to say anybody who has anything critical to say about us, they must automatically be influenced by Satan. That's a red flag. A particularly extreme version of information control, you look again at North Korea right now. The common people aren't supposed to have access to the general internet. I understand it's a capital offense if you're caught watching foreign sitcom. you can be killed for watching Seinfeld over there because it is considered foreign propaganda, and can understand why the regime would be so concerned if they're trying to control people and control the information that is coming in and out. It's important that they don't hear other stories from their perspective. And that's why, over and over again, if you listen to North Korean defectors, survivors, people who have escaped, very often their road to freedom started with a pirated DVD or a pirated USB stick full of foreign film, when they were able to look on the outside and see that there's another life that's better than what's on the inside. So that's an extreme example of how much information can be controlled. Again, in my experience in the cult that I grew up in, the rank and file members, there's a certain degree of information control. They're told not to watch certain kinds of movies, and they're also strongly encouraged not to listen to any criticism of the organization. Anybody who has anything to say about the organization that doesn't cast it in a positive light was automatically described as being from Satan, and don't listen to that because it's all lies. And it's dismissed out of hand rather than dealing with a given criticism fairly on its own merits, or ever entertaining the possibility that there could be anything wrong with the organization. So, information control in terms of what you can watch and not watch. When I was working for the cult for a couple of years, when I was deeper into it and serving as a recruiter, missionary, the information control was so thorough that we couldn't even, watch all church movies or listen to all church music. We had a small group of like 5 books that we could read, along with the scriptures that the organization believed in, and then like church magazines, and for the most part, with very few exceptions, that's all that we were able to expose ourselves to for years. That information control, completely surrounding a brain with information from one source, and it becomes your reality. It gets into you deep. And I can remember kind of starving for outside input on the mission. I believed very much in what I was doing, but I had this guilty pleasure. Are you ready for this guilty, sinful pleasure that I had? So I felt so bad about this at the time, but someone had said that, if you're reading these books and you come across a word that you don't understand, then it's okay to have a dictionary around and look at that to look up a word. And so I think I even just found on the street, on the ground at one point, laying around, a small dictionary of unusual words. And, our routine was so regimented at the time, and we could only read these particular books. And when we saw TV, we were supposed to avert our eyes. You couldn't even do that. When you were at this level in the cult, couldn't even watch normal television. And I remember I got this dictionary. I picked up this dictionary and brought it home, and I was like, hey, if I run across a word I don't understand, I can read it. But then I found myself just flipping through this dictionary hungrily, looking for more words, looking for other things besides what I was being kind of force-fed this whole time, and I felt so bad. I felt like I was so disobedient and evil for reading a dictionary, if you can believe that. That's where my headspace was at the time. But that's how much control they had over me, and over the information that I ingested. So much that I felt bad inside, even if I was reading a dictionary. That's a big key part of these control mechanisms. You're controlled from the outside, but the goal is to install control mechanisms on the inside so that you'll police yourself. And what I described there is a good example. So we've been in the B.I.T.E model, B.I.T.E. We've gone through B, behavior control, I, information control. The next level of control is what's called thought control, which I just described a little bit about how you're taught to police yourself. You're taught to internalize the group's doctrine as truth. Again, reading from Dr. Hassan's website. There's a principle that Robert J. Lifton uses called the sacred science that he uses to describe cults. And basically the idea is that the group is the source of all truth, and if anything conflicts with the group's truth, then it's either a lie or just hasn't caught up with it yet. That all of science and philosophy, that they're ultimately leading to the one truth of the group. And again, in the cult that I grew up with, there was a quote from one of the early leaders that was very similar to that if the science and the doctrine, if the science of the world and the doctrine of the church are ever in conflict, it's because we don't understand one of them well enough, but they'll eventually converge because the doctrine is true and perfect. And any place that science is at variance from it, it's where science is making a mistake yet, or we don't understand the doctrine clearly enough yet, but the doctrine has to be true. It can never make a mistake. So the framing, this portion of thought control, is the framing of everything you learn from the group of it is the absolute truth. You have to think of it as absolute truth, and the sorts of questions you're even willing to ask yourself. You can't ask yourself in a legitimate way, is this true? Like we were taught to ask if this is true, but the assumption was that you were to ask until you believed it was true, rather than really having any sort of accountability of the doctrines to discount them if they were disproven. If something was disproven, then you were supposed to do mental gymnastics until you could kind of look at it squinty and sideways and say, oh yeah, this could be true if we make this assumption, this assumption. Oh yeah. And eventually I started counting how many excuses I was making for the doctrine and realized that the simplest thing was just for it not to be true. But I was really good at those mental gymnastics, and that's part of this thought control. Is you've got this assumption that it has to be true, and you do whatever mental gymnastics you can to get to that assumed goal. Other sorts of thought control. The use of what are called loaded language. And again, we'll talk about this again with Dr. Lifton's work in the Lifton's 8 criteria. But, the words that we use are the architecture of our thoughts. We write and speak, as it has been said, to find out what we're thinking. And if the types of words that we use are fed to us and controlled by a group, then we're only able to think the sorts of thoughts that those words allow us to think. So this can go everywhere from making words taboo. You can't use certain sorts of words. It can be you're supposed to use words that have lots and lots of meaning wrapped up into it. The ways that you refer to the church and the titles of authority figures, you're supposed to call people by their official titles, and wrapped into those titles are a group of assumptions. So in our particular organization, we had what was called a prophet. Now, prophet, if you look up in the dictionary, you might find a definition of somebody who tells the future, and that was part of it. But in our group, there were all sorts of ideas wrapped up into this idea of a prophet, someone that was called of God, someone that had authority, someone that spoke on behalf of God. And when you hear the prophet speak, you're supposed to heed their voice as if it's God themselves speaking. All of these ideas wrapped up into this one word, prophet. And when you hear that word prophet, you snap to attention and you listen to whatever they say and you take it as exact truth. Another thing that a lot of cults will do in terms of thought control is to tell you that only certain types of thoughts are legitimate or allowed. Certain types of thoughts and emotions. We'll get to emotion a little bit more, but they'll engage in things called thought stopping. So let's say you start to think about the doctrines or teachings of a group and something doesn't make sense. So you learn something about the history and you realize, oh, maybe these guys weren't as nice of guys as I was taught, and I was taught kind of a mythologized history, but there was actually some not good stuff that they did. You start to have those sorts of thoughts. Those are not the sorts of thoughts that you're supposed to have. And depending on the group, they may outright punish you if you start to express these sorts of thoughts. A lot of times it'll be sort of a deceptively sweet, paternal sort of situation where they'll say, "Oh, I can see you're being distressed by this thought. Let me teach you how you can not be disturbed by that anymore." And they'll teach you these things called thought stopping techniques. Some groups use chanting. If they start to have doubts, they'll start to maybe say a word over and over and over again. And that word, if they can focus and kind of meditate on that word, will drive everything else out, and they'll stop thinking that way. Other thought-stopping techniques include ceremonies. I've spoken in the past about how my cult had a ceremony that you were supposed to go to if you were having a hard time, or especially if you had doubts, to go commune with God in this ceremony. And it was this very long and boring affair, but it was also like very, very rhythmic, and doing chanting and dressed in robes with other people, and it was an experience that kind of put you into this dissociative state that caused you to let go of whatever concerns that you had before, and you come out the other side of it not so worried about whatever doubt you may have had or whatever concerns you had about the group. Other forms of thought stopping, for instance, in conversion therapy, gay conversion therapy, something that has been done is, they'll to try to get the person to stop being gay, which is, medical malpractice and awful, and I've got a whole rant about that. But one of the thought-stopping techniques that they use is when a person starts to experience sexual attraction to someone of the same sex, they've got a rubber band on their wrist, and they start snapping the rubber band and focusing on the sensation of the sting of the rubber band on their wrist until those thoughts go away. That's a thought-stopping technique. For me, as a trans person, my bishop taught me visualization techniques to thought stop my gender experience. Singing is used in this way a lot of the time. There's various cults will say if you're starting to doubt or have quote unquote dark feelings, hum your favorite hymn and use music in your head to drive things out. Sometimes it can be a phrase like doubt your doubts. That's a really common one. Someone says doubt your doubts instead of pursuing your doubts and using critical thought and skepticism to pursue them to their logical end to find out what's true and not true. That's not quite as snappy a phrase as doubt your doubts, but what doubt your doubts does is it prevents you from going through that process of critical thought, stops the exploration and helps you jump back in line with the group. Speaking in tongues is another way that people do this. I'm looking here again in thought control, forbidding critical questions about the leader, doctrine, or the policies, labeling alternative belief systems as illegitimate, evil, or not useful, instilling a new quote-unquote map of reality. Additionally, a lot of these groups, a lot of cults will describe certain types of thoughts and feelings as evil outright. There's a Star Wars quote that was used a lot in my cult from Yoda, and it said basically anger, darkness, the dark side are these. If you ever feel anger or doubt or fear or any of those things, those are not legitimate feelings. Those are all the influence of Satan. When really, those can be very useful feelings. There's situations where they're more and less useful. Maybe you don't want to be feeling them all the time. But tell you what, particularly anger is your body and brain's way of telling you when it's being wronged and it needs to protect itself. When it's being attacked or abused and needs to protect itself. That's what your body is telling you. But a lot of these groups will try to crush that ability to get angry, because if you can get angry, then maybe you might listen to the signals your body is giving you about the abuse that you're undergoing and be angry at the leaders and leave. So to avoid that, anger is kind of banished outright as a satanic emotion, or the equivalent in whatever group it is. I've been speaking largely about religious cults, but these can be equally applicable in corporate cults, self-help and therapy cults. When I say self-help and therapy cults, I need to add the proviso that there are lots and lots of legitimate mental health professionals and therapy professionals. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about people who use the guise of self-help and therapy, but utilize the techniques and tactics of cults and undue influence and use it as a vehicle for a cult. But that's different from legitimate therapists. And, I think it's important to seek out legitimate therapists and get that appropriate medical help. I'm a huge proponent of that. So jumping back in, for instance, in a corporate cult, say, a lot of these multi-level marketing groups, they'll say, if you're doubting your ability to sell a product or to recruit people, there's a lot of flack given to people, and they're told that they're being negative. They're told that they need to fix their thinking. If there's people around them that are doubting, you're told to put people out of your life that quote unquote don't believe in you, or because they don't see the viability of the business model, and very quickly your social circle contracts to include mostly people that are involved in that multi-level marketing company, and they hype each other up and get into a fervor to go out and recruit. But any thought pattern that doubts what's being done, doubts the product, or doubts that people are interested in the product, that's treated just like anger is treated in a religious cult. Now, I mentioned the word flack there, and flack is a term that's used to describe types of control that may not be formalized. There may not be a written punishment that, if you break this rule, then this consequence is going to happen to you. That's a type of control too. But flack and soft social control, those are strongly involved in all of these things too. Jumping back to the beginning when I was talking about behavior control and information control, there may not always be a direct consequence for, say, looking at material critical of the cult in the way that, in North Korea, you get outside information, you could be executed. In my church, you wouldn't necessarily be kicked out for reading material that was critical of the organization, but there was a heavy social stigma against it. If you were reading it or listening to it or hearing any of it, you were thought of as less than, and people would discourage you because they thought that would pollute your soul, and there was a lot of heavy social pressure. And beyond that, there was reading it, and then if you started to believe any of it or have what they called sympathies with the opposition, that could be grounds for not being able to participate in some of the important ordinances of the church, ordinances that would be required for you and your family to be together in heaven. So it was pretty serious stuff. There was kind of a range of consequences, from soft social consequences to our perception of the time, very concrete and grievous consequences. But it can range from flack and ribbing and stigma to physical consequences, depending on the group. There's all of these things have a range. There are spectra of these attributes. It's not an on or off switch. It's not black or white. Every group and organization may have a bit of each of these elements, but the less of them that you can have, the better. And everybody's got room to improve. But the more of these that are in place, the more toxic the situation, and the more I would advise you to get out of Dodge. All right. So we've talked about behavior control, information control, thought control. The last one is emotional control. And we've talked about some of these a little bit because these, if you couldn't tell already, these categories overlap. Like behavior control, is controlling how you dress, but you could also say behavior control is controlling what books you read. That's also information control. So there's also overlap. Emotional control has a lot of overlap with thought control. And I've talked about some of these principles already. Again, from Dr. Hassan's website, emotional control. Number 1, manipulate and narrow the range of feelings. Some emotions and or needs are deemed as evil, wrong, or selfish. So we've kind of covered some of that territory, but similar here. Teach emotion-stopping techniques to block feelings of homesickness, anger, or doubt. I can remember when I was serving as a recruiter far from home, a lot of us would get very homesick. We actually weren't allowed to talk with our families except for twice a year, even though the technology was available for us to do so. It was just incredibly locked down. It was almost like you're in a... You were walking out on the street on a regular basis and talking to people, but many aspects of the lifestyle were akin to the treatment of felons in a high-security prison. It was this kind of weird hybrid situation. One of those things was that we couldn't talk to our loved ones except for through writing once a week or through phone calls twice a year on Christmas and Mother's Day. Now, I understand some of that has softened since I left the group. A lot of people were having some pretty serious mental health issues, but for generations and generations, that was the rules for recruiters, and that's only softened a little bit just recently. And homesickness, if you started to get homesick, there was some sympathy for that, but there was also some stigma and ribbing about it. If someone wanted to go home and felt and missed their family, there was this term that was used called trunky. Oh, that person is so trunky. And it was kind of a derogatory term. Oh, you want to go home, you wimp, And it was also seemingly indicating of someone that was less committed, less righteous. You were less than if you were homesick. So that would be an example of emotional control. Number 3 on Dr. Hassan's list, make the person feel that problems are always their own fault, never the leader's or the group's fault. And this, people, if you've experienced a cult or an abusive relationship, which, many of the same phenomena, I'm convinced that they're the same thing, just at different scales. That's going to be a very, very similar, familiar sensation to you of, if you're feeling doubt, it's not that there could be issues with the group. You feel incredibly guilty for feeling doubtful because you are not faithful, not righteous. And if you have concerns about the leadership, if you think that you see them doing bad things and you feel upset and anger at them, you turn that inward at yourself because you're not supposed to feel that way. It always becomes your fault. And, sometimes things are our fault, and it's good to have that self-awareness. But these groups kind of take advantage of people's willingness to introspect and improve themselves by deflecting all blame away from the leadership. So if they're flipping everything and making it your fault all the time, that's a red flag. Number 4, Dr. Hassan lists is promote feelings of guilt or unworthiness, such as identity guilt, such as, if you're LGBT in a lot of these groups, and you feel less than because of that, or you're taught that you're wicked. That's something I really struggled with growing up as a transgender person. Guilt that you're not living up to your potential. In my group, there were prophecies that were given to us when we reached a certain age about what the rest of our life was going to be like. And mine said that I was going to do some big stuff and have big leadership positions in the church. And as I got older and was working so hard towards those things that I was supposedly destined for and didn't see them happening, I felt very guilty about that. I thought that maybe I wasn't working hard enough, that I was being too selfish and sinful to be able to meet that potential, and I felt that maybe I was letting people down that I would be able to help if I didn't meet that potential that was prophesied for me. There's lots of different other forms that this could take, but that's one that it took for me. Other forms of emotional control. It talks about, he says, your affiliations are unwise, guilt about who you associate with. And, there's people who are positive and negative influences that you can associate with, and everybody kind of has to figure that out for themselves. But in many groups, they'll say, don't talk to people that are a member of this other specific religion, or who are outside of your group. In my religion, there was a stigma against marrying or dating anybody outside of your group. That was a no-no. It can be racial. It can, be all sorts of things. Social guilt, historical guilt. They instill fear, such as fear of thinking independently, fear of the outside world. I think of Tangled. If you've seen that Disney movie where the princess who's up in the tower, Rapunzel, is taught to stay in the tower because the outside world is this scary place. And that's a really common thing that cults use as emotional manipulation, is they'll tell stories of, if you leave, all these awful things will happen to you. If you leave, you're going to go to hell, or awful things will happen to the people that you care about, or you won't be able to be with your family in heaven. That's something that I was taught, and that was really traumatic for me when my mother realized that it was a cult and left, and she tried really hard to be there for us emotionally and in every other way. But the story that we were being told was that we weren't going to be able to see her in heaven, or live with her in heaven in any case. And that was incredibly traumatic to me at 7 years old, and I was always trying to recruit her back. And it, poisoned our relationship for years. And I can only imagine how hard that must have been for her to, have my sibling and I come visit her, and we're trying to recruit her instead of just appreciating the time. That's a heavy and hard thing. A lot of groups also engage in shunning. If you leave the group, then you no longer exist. They won't talk to you anymore. and there's varying degrees of that. Some of them, it's shunning altogether. In other groups, you leave, they'll talk to you, but if you start talking about why you left, then they get very uncomfortable. Or maybe you're not supposed to talk about those sorts of things because you'll poison the group. I remember when I confided in my congregation leader, that in the bishop at the time, that I was having these doubts about the church. I was told that I was no longer to speak or contribute in any of the Sunday school meetings, which I had formerly been very active in and had been a teacher for many years. But I was not. I could sit in them, but I was not to comment, because my comments might infect the rest of the congregation, because I had doubts. Other forms of emotional manipulation, emotional control, phobia indoctrination, inculcating irrational fears, and I just talked about this, about leaving the group or questioning the leader's authority. You're taught that no happiness or fulfillment, I'm just going to read some of this list here to wrap up. No happiness or fulfillment possible outside of the group. That's one that we were taught, that other people might think they're happy, but there's no true joy outside of this one organization. There are terrible consequences if you leave. Hell, demon possession, incurable diseases, accidents, suicide, insanity, 10,000 reincarnations, etc. It says, never a legitimate reason to leave. Those who leave are weak, undisciplined, unspiritual, worldly, brainwashed by a family or counselor. That's an ironic one. Or seduced by money, sex, or rock and roll. I remember that we were told in the church that people, we would have these conversations about why people would leave the church. Why would anybody ever leave the one true church and the one path to be together with your family? And we were told that people left because they wanted to sin, or left because they were weak, or left because they were offended and let their beef with a particular individual become more important than their salvation and that of their family, and that they were selfish. Last, it says threats of harm to ex-members and families. The group that I was involved with, the threat of harm, again, largely had to do with you were no longer part of your eternal family. So kind of an eternal shunning. They could visit you in heaven, but you wouldn't be in the same heaven. You wouldn't be a family in the same way anymore. In the past, things were a bit more serious. The group has, again, softened over time, over the generations. There are groups that will harass and harm people that leave, that will dox them, release their name and address and contact info so that people can harass them at their home or send them a hate mail. Back to North Korea, I keep using the North Korea example. People who leave, since they can't be punished outside of North Korea's jurisdiction very easily, a lot of times what they'll do is they'll take family members who had nothing to do with that person defecting and put them in political prisoner camps. They'll say, hey, you might be home free, but you got this on your conscience that your mom is in this concentration camp. They punish people through family members. That's something that happens. And again, it's on a spectrum, but that's something that happens. So we've been over B.I.T.E, behavior control, information control, thought control, and emotional control. These are all aspects of cult control in the B.I.T.E model, Dr. Stephen Hassan's B.I.T.E model. It's a very useful way to very quickly look at a group or organization and determine what sorts of control mechanisms are in place, whether it's healthy or toxic, and to evaluate whether or not you should continue to be involved in it. Or, if you're an organization that's largely healthy but only has some of the stuff going on a little bit, if you feel that it's healthy enough to stay, maybe, and that you might be able to have a positive influence, these are ways that you can improve your organization or even your personal conduct. A lot of times when I look at cult models, I'll look at my past and I'll look at organizations that I see around me and look at it at the macro scale, but I also look at myself. I think of myself as a parent. I look at my child and how I interact with him, and I think, hey, I was raised in this toxic situation, and I was taught that this is how you lead, this is how you interact with people, and not all of that is right. And I'm continuing to learn how to be kinder, how to be less controlling, less manipulative, because again, it's even if you've got a good heart, this stuff can be ingrained in you. And I'm continuing to try to improve myself, and a big part of that is by understanding what's unhealthy. So that is the B.I.T.E model. This has been a presentation of FLIT Cult Literacy. I'm not sponsored in any way or have really affiliation with Dr. Hassan, just a big fan of his work, and it helped me understand what happened to me as a cult member and is a part of my continued healing. I will make sure to include links to his web presence in the description. I would highly recommend checking his work out, and make sure that FLIT's a great resource. I encourage you to use it and share it, but also don't let it be your only resource. Look at Dr. Hassan, look at Dr. Lifton, look at Dr. Margaret Singer, look at the research that's being done in lots of different places, and come to your own opinion. Don't let anybody be your guru. Take what works, leave what doesn't, be your own person. I'm going to sign out here and just wish happiness and freedom to you and yours. Sending much love.